people. Amina, if you could please let me know when we're live on YouTube. So we can
You're live.
note. Okay, thank you. Hi YouTube. Welcome to the Lurie Daniel Favors Show. Again, I'm filming from a different studio, so yes, I know I look like very brown in weird ways, but just go with it and hear the content of what I'm saying. We've been talking on Urban View about this notion that I've been toying with about welfare queens, right? And welfare queens, for those of you who are not familiar with the concept of welfare queens, this is a notion that we really saw pick up a lot of steam in the 1980s during the era of Reaganomics, when Ronald Reagan and the Republican Party really showed, for those of us who are still alive at this moment, showed their asses and showed really what it is they are about when it comes to governance and to leadership. And so welfare queens, the Willie Horton ads, these were all sort of a type of trope that basically, a type of stereotypes that were used to describe black people who were considered to be, as black people, lazy. We know the stereotypes: greedy, depending on the government, couldn't go along without their own, always needing a handout. And there was this constant drumbeat of discourse that basically framed black people as being utterly dependent on the government, fully incapable of navigating their own lives, and in need of guidance and support because they were just too, quite frankly, inferior and incapable of managing themselves. And one of the things that I talk about way more extensively in today's podcast episode, Lurie Breaks It Down, which I encourage you all to download. Please give it 5 stars. Please write a review. I love reading the reviews. I wish I could reply to them, but for some reason I can't on the platforms that I'm reading them. But I want you all to know, those of you who have written a review, thank you. But in today's podcast episode, which I explore this topic a bit more in depth, there is this, we're used to seeing raced, and I'm RACED, raced people, and we're used to thinking about people who have a race as black people, as Latino people, even though Latino is not a race. Latino was an ethnic category, but you can be a black Latino, you can be a white Latino, you could be an Asian Latino, you could be a Jewish Latino. Latino is not a race, right? And so what we think about people who have a race as like the Asians, the blacks, the Latinos, and even though white people are a race, and white is technically a color, even if it is the absence of all color, argue with your mom, not me, the idea that white people have a race is sort of weird. Like we tend to think of white people as people because we live in a racist society, and everywhere else is raced. Everybody else is a racial group. White people are people. So white people are Americans. Black people are Black Americans or Asian Americans or Latino Americans. And so we're in a moment that's really weird right now, because part of MAGA and part of the rise of white nationalism is this, at least in 2025, is this claiming of grievance. Right? We live in a society right now where racist white people have felt like, it's the blacks always get to talk about how they don't have what they need. Well, I'm a white man and there are things that I need that I don't get, and it's because I'm white. And these are people who believe that there is a such thing as racism that they experience. They call it reverse racism. And again, white people, there's no such thing as reverse racism. Racism is a system of power and the distribution of power and access that is based on race, either providing it to certain races or restricting it from other races. There's no such thing as a reverse racism. You're either the victim of that or you're not. But we have a white population right now, a subset, that is claiming to be the victims of race and of racism. And this is a group of people that are doing things that are kind of crazy, right? Like taking a piece of legislation like the 14th Amendment and saying that the 14th Amendment, which was a legislative phenomenal victory, a phenomenally legislative victory that basically was put into the Constitution, that said black people who had been victimized by a slave system, the entire American economy had been founded on a system of slave labor. And the 14th Amendment was literally an amendment put into the Constitution that said you cannot maintain black people as a slave class in this society anymore. They are going to be equal to the whites. And we should query whether we have ever been we should query why we would ever want to be equal to people who were so diabolical and devastatingly brutish that's what they did to the planet. That's what they do to the planet. We would never want to be equal to the devil. So not saying that anybody is a devil, but we would never want to be equal to low level energy like that. But that's a conversation for another day. But these people today who believe that they are the victims of racism as white people, these people today basically are taking the 14th Amendment, which was a piece of legislation designed to protect black people from the racist white people, and saying, well, it should also apply to us as whites because we as whites are also the victims of racism, and so we should be protected. And these are the same sorts of white people that and I'm going to talk a little bit again more extensively about this in the podcast episode when we had Dr. John Boyd Jr. on, the president of the National Black Farmers Association. And what did he say? He talked to us about the fact that it would take over 300 days over 380 days, I believe was the number, but certainly over 300 days for a black farmer to get access to the known benefits and the programs that the government gives out to farmers, to white farmers, whereas white farmers could get their loans approved in 30 days. And you'll hear some of that conversation in the discussion that we'll have today in the podcast. But what has been unsettling for me, and here's where I'm trying to work this out. So you all let me know what you think about this in the comments and as we take your calls. But what's been unsettling for me is that now that we have white Americans who are claiming to be the victims of racism, it feels like you should also then be subjected to the type of discourse and framing of issues that the rest of us who have been traditionally raced in this country are subjected to. So the same way that black people were called welfare queens and were considered to be lazy. And the reason they had welfare reform was because these lazy black people and the lazy blacks needed to figure out how to pull themselves up by their own damn bootstraps, get their straps, get dumb it. And so like we have an understanding that when you are raced and racialized in this country, you don't just get to claim grievance and talk about the ways that you have been victimized by racism. You also have to carry the burden of being discussed as a racial group. And so I think we should try this a bit because it's new. Right? Typically black people, typically non-white people do not talk about white people in the way that I'm going to in this example. But I think it's important that we reorient ourselves, because if you're going to claim to be the victims of racism, then you also get to carry the burdens of being a racialized group. So yes, claim your racial oppression grievances, but now we get to talk about y'all the way y'all used to talk about us and still do. And I thought perhaps if we had an example of a subset of the American population, the white American population, that would make this a little bit easier, because I don't want this to be an esoteric thing. I want us to have a clear understanding as to what it means now that white people are claiming that they are the victims of racism. Not all whites. We got the righteous whites, I get it. But for those who are. And so we're adjusting to this new 2025 era of open racism. So let's try it. And remember, this is a different form of communication. We don't often talk about white people in this way, but they want to be a racialized group. So let's show them what that looks like. And I'm going to use white farmers as an example, because I think white farmers as a subset of white people give us a lot of room to work with, particularly in light of what I shared with you about my conversation with Dr. John Boyd Jr. And so white farmers, if we were talking about them as a racially aggrieved group, the way that we have been discussed, that conversation might go something like this. White farmers are the biggest, laziest, greediest, non-workingest welfare queens on the planet. They claim that they work so hard, but they're just too goddamn lazy to figure out how to make ends meet without relying on government handouts and bailouts. You may remember that when Donald Trump was in office the first time, and I mean, my God, what more do they want? We elected a whole ass open racist that should have been a direct pipeline for them feeling like they were empowered to do what they needed to do. But under Donald Trump's first administration, they got so many bailouts because they just couldn't hack it as farmers. And so this is important that we consider this, because if they're going to be a racialized group, then again, we should have a different form of discussing them, because that's what happens when you're a racialized group. But these groups, the white farmers, they're so incapable of producing profits that they're constantly whining and lobbying the government. They have an actual lobby to go to the government to talk about how incapable they are of managing their own farms. Now, I am not one to gossip. Shout out to Benita Betrayal. I'm not one to gossip, but I have been told that their education is it's kind of subpar as compared to what black farmers might get. And so go with me for a minute. I know it might feel a little like we're stepping on eggshells here, but let's just try it. Their education is actually pretty inferior. You see, white farmers don't come from centuries or really even millennia, certainly not millennia, but definitely not even centuries of farming, agricultural, and expertise. And we know this because when their ancestors got here, they didn't know anything about farming. In fact, they were dying, literally dying, until the indigenous people saved them. And they had devolved into cannibalism, child. It was a terrible thing because they eat people in spaces where you don't come from a land of abundance like Africans. And so Europeans, when they got here, didn't know anything about farming, didn't understand the climate, didn't understand how to engage with nature. It was as if they were just bumbling, stumbling fools who were too inferior to save their own lives. And so they had to figure some things out. And what they did was what they're good at doing, what their culture often drives them to do, which is to just dominate and take and steal and thieve. And it's not that all of them are thieves but their culture I don't know what they're teaching in the home. I don't know what their fathers are telling them. But their culture is one that definitely lends itself to this weird scenario where they're the only ones on the planet who can't get along with anybody. Very violent. Again, I have to blame the culture. We should ask what's happening with the fathers and at the dinner table. But let's get back to this conversation about the farmers. And so these farmers, who really weren't farmers at this point, they were just white people who had stolen land. They decided to then go get agricultural experts. And that is exactly what they did. So they went to Africa, where people who lived in a land of abundance, who had cultivated for millennia agricultural practices, understood a few basic things. Like, one, you can't farm the same crop on the same plot of land over and over and over again, because you deplete the land of the services or the nutrients that it needs. You have to rotate your crops. You have to give your crops some time to lay down. Hell, that's even in the Bible, which these folks claim to follow. But the reality is they didn't know things. And so they did what their culture drives them to do, which is to steal, kill, and thieve and enslave. And that's what they did. And they brought enslaved Africans over here. They brought Africans over here who they enslaved because they were agricultural geniuses and were able to produce things from the ground that they did not know how to produce. Now, you would have thought, had they been a little less, inferior in their approach to learning, they might have decided to learn what those indigenous Africans were telling them or what the indigenous people of America were telling them, but they didn't. And they engaged in farming practices that were so devastating to the land that they depleted all of the nutrients. And when many farmers in the Great Depression and during the Dust Bowl era began losing their farms because the land was over depleted and they had not nurtured the land properly, they didn't listen to the people who actually knew things, because if you were intelligent, wouldn't you want to listen to the people who knew things? But that's aside. And so after depleted the land, these farmers end up going bankrupt and not being able to, even though during this entire time, the U.S. Department of Agriculture was giving them favorable loan terms, was helping them out, giving them bailouts, giving them money. Now, I wasn't giving anything to the blacks. Didn't give anything to the black farmers, but that's a story for a later part of this conversation. And so these white farmers then end up losing a lot of their farms and have to sell to agricultural corporations. Now, these corporations are also run by their own people. And you would have thought that perhaps, generations gone by that they would have learned. But again, it's the culture. We have to ask what's happening in the household. Maybe it's the music or the dancing. I don't know what it is. But there's something about their culture that is leading them to continue to make these mistakes. Because even as agricultural corporations who have now purchased up all this farmland, they are still in a situation where today we are getting additional reports about the fact that the Trump administration is going to have to bail out these farmers, which is terrible. But it's also challenging because not only do they not know how to care for the land properly, and they're losing their farms to these corporations that are run by their own people. But what's also happening is that these corporations will bring all these animals that they don't know how to properly care for, and they hook them up to these machines, and then they can't clean them, and then they get sick and diseased, and then the meat that they put into their food supply is also sick and diseased, and then they have to inject all these animals with all these chemicals to try to keep them alive. They are really not good at this work, and they're welfare queens, because all they do is go to the government with their hands out begging for a support line, begging for welfare. In fact, Amina, do we have the clip of the gentleman, the black farmer, who talked about the difference between what white farmers and what black farmers experience? Do we have that clip ready?
Yes,
do we
I
not?
do.
We do. Okay. I want you all to listen. Now, YouTube, you're not going to be able to see this clip because I don't have it readily available. I want you to listen to this clip where we hear from a black farmer who was never allowed to get access to these benefits. A black farmer who understood how to ingratiate themselves with the land. A black farmer who's never gotten to be able to get one of them handouts. He is a part of the National Black Farmers Association, like a Dr. John Boyd Jr. And so the black farmers, as they were watching white farmers get all the land, because the U.S. Department of Agriculture, also run by them, was stealing land from black people, making sure that white farmers who did not know how to produce crops on their land in a way that was economically sustainable and viable, giving them bailouts, giving them everything that they need, giving them handouts because they're greedy and they're lazy and they can't figure it out. And apparently there's something wrong with their education and their culture. Now, again, this is all hypothetical, of course, because we're just talking about this group of people as we would if they had been raced the way the other people had. I want you all to listen to what the black farmers who don't get these handouts, who don't get all the benefits, and who don't get to be lazy and sloppy and ignorant about what they're doing. Listen to what the black farmers are having to navigate.
So I'm a black farmer, and a lot of people are wondering, why are black farmers not panicking like a lot of white farmers? Well, let me explain to you the reasons why. It's because white farmers have been handed everything to them, a lot of them. Not saying all of them, but a good bit of them. And by that I mean this. MLK even pointed out, he says, farmers in the West and the Midwest who were white, they were given land, they were given money, they were given training, they were given a lot. Whereas the black farmers weren't given anything, and the largest civil rights settlement in U.S. history is Pickford v. Glickman. where you had a class action lawsuit, bunch of black farmers all joined the lawsuit, and they won a huge settlement because the USDA was shown to be racist for decades. So because black farmers haven't been given anything, we've been learning to do without, unlike your white farmers. So when things are taken away from you, all your subsidies, all your tax breaks, guess what? You panic. Whereas we've always been going through this shit. So there's problems in privilege.
Oh, there's problems in privilege. If you weren't just so greedy, if you worked a little harder, if you understood how to really farm and really make it work, you wouldn't be in this situation. And what situation am I talking about right now? I'm talking about the fact that Donald Trump, just 7 months in, is already having to have conversations about how to bail out white farmers because of his trade policies and tariffs. Now, his trade policies and tariffs are not the fault of white farmers, although maybe they are, because white farmers largely voted for Donald Trump and largely voted for him despite the fact that they knew that the tariffs that he had implemented in his first term also required them to get bailouts. But when you're a welfare queen, you don't mind taking freebies from the government. In fact, when you're a welfare queen, you will create situations where you are dependent on the government, be it large or small, to get your needs met. And now we're seeing reports that Trump is ready in administration part 2 to bail out farmers amid the trade war squeeze. Now, what you heard in that clip from that black farmer, because what he talked about was, wow, farmers are panicking. They're panicking right now because as the trade war is continuing, we're no longer able to sell soybeans to China. We're no longer able to sell beef or engage in the beef trade with Japan and Brazil the way we used to. Nobody at USAID, which was an organization that Donald Trump and elongated muskrat destroyed with big balls and tiny sack over at Doge, was an entity that had been set up by this country to buy food from white farmers and distribute to other countries, but they destroyed USAID. And so now white farmers who were not competing on an open market, who were not a part of the open playing field, they were not a part of the free market system, they were getting welfare subsidies, because even when they were getting free land and their land was not being stolen from them, even when they were able to get their loans approved by the USDA in 30 days, even though black people had to wait over a year, even though they were able to get land that was stolen from other people, and they were told, their ancestors were given an opportunity to run out and grab whatever acreage they could. They kicked all the indigenous off of it who had been living on the land. Shout out to Demario Solomon Simmons, who we just talked to about with the indigenous Creek Nation and what's happening there. But they were given free land because they didn't have the money to pay for it, because again, their culture doesn't work out. They were given access to seed. They were given access to animals. They ruined it. They don't know a lot of things, and they don't listen to the people who do, because they're also very prideful, very uppity. These farmers are very uppity to be such utter failures as it pertains to how we traditionally measure one's capacity to succeed on the open market. And so we're in a moment right now where farmers are talking about bailouts and needing bailouts because the person they put into office, who himself was white, entitled, and incompetent, and had no other qualifications other than that, has created an economic situation where they are now floundering. But you know who's not floundering? Black farmers. Why aren't black farmers farming? Well, because as you heard from the black farmer in that clip, there is protection in not having access to privilege. And there are problems when all you do as a welfare queen is just ask for more and more handouts and government and will you please and can you help me and here, please, sir, can we have some more? I suggest that we have a gathering of the white farming community. Perhaps they need mentors. Maybe they need some insight from people who are not used to getting privilege, because here's the other thing that we know about white farmers. There was a moment when black farmers, Latino and Asian farmers, who had traditionally been excluded from getting all of the benefits that white farmers had received. Do you remember what that farmer said? Under the Biden-Harris administration, they had put together a package of $5 billion that was going to finally, after over 100 years of the U.S. Department of Agriculture stealing land from black people, refusing to approve their loans, forcing them to spend entire farm seasons incapacitated while they were focusing on the weak welfare queen white farmers. Do you remember what happened under the Biden-Harris administration? When the Biden-Harris administration put together that $5 billion package that was going to help restore, not fully repair, but help to restore some of the harm that black farmers had been subjected to, what did the welfare queen white farmers do? Well, as you hear in the podcast, which we'll be releasing again later on today, the welfare queen farmers, they decided that they couldn't take it. They couldn't compete. They could not bear the idea that after having received all of these benefits for decades, that finally, black farmers were also going to get a piece of the welfare queen farming pie. And you know what those white welfare queen farmers did? They went to court. They went to white courts where they knew they would have a favorable audience because, again, WEI reigns supreme in this nation. And they went to those white courts and they filed lawsuits in those white courts. And those white judges, recognizing the inferior capability of white farmers. And I must presume that they recognize white farmers were inferior, because why else would you then move to block black farmers from getting just a piece of that $5 billion bucket when white farmers had for decades been given everything, had it handed to them, had their funds provided for them, got their loans approved on time, got all the benefits and privileges of a queen. And they filed so many lawsuits that black farmers did not get a stitch of that money and are forced to do what they have always done, which is to be experts at their field, despite the fact that they are dealing with a whole ass group of welfare queens who will do everything they can to undermine the ability of anybody else to farm, even though they don't know things. And their culture continues to coddle them and allow them to just be as mediocre as they always have been. And so I think now that we have an experience, and I'm going to pull out of the example now. Do you see how that works? Do you see how, if you're going to claim white people or white MAGA people, if you're going to claim racial oppression, what it means? What it means is we get to talk about you as a racial group. And I think it's important that we cultivate the energy to do so. Now, black people, keep in mind, this is new for us. We often have these conversations in our private spaces. We don't often get a chance to have these conversations out loud and in public. We're going to have to do that because out right now, we have a situation where these people have flooded the streets of DC. They're flooding black cities with all sorts of governing, policing apparatus. They're doing everything they can to hide from their own inadequacies and to hope that we are no longer going to continue asking, why the hell have you not released the Epstein files? Because again, if I were in power and I'm the president and I run Congress in the House and I run Congress in the Senate and we got all the power and I know I'm not in them files, I'm going to release the files. But it feels like they're doing everything they can to avoid releasing those files, including flooding black communities with all of these police officers, which we're going to talk more extensively about tomorrow. But I just feel as though in this new era of Project 2025 racism, it feels to me like we black people and other non-white people have to get much more adept at cultivating public language to address what it means to talk about white people as a racialized group. You have traditionally not been in this space, but you have traditionally benefited from racism. It just so happens that now that you have indicated that you are aggrieved, that you are victimized by racism, well, take a number, sweet. Take a number, get in line. We're going to talk about you the same way that you talk about us, so we can all be equal opportunity, because I know that y'all don't like anybody getting any extra benefits except yourselves. Because again, welfare queen mentality. Get off of your dependency of the government. It's embarrassing. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps or your farmer overalls. You can do it. We believe in you. And you know why we believe in you? Because that's what we do. We believe in ourselves and we get it done. And we get it done without your help. And despite the fact that you are an oppressive entity that does everything that you can to create stumbling blocks, but the stumbling block you have laid down for us is going to be the boulder over which you trip yourselves. We got to go to commercial break. Overview, I will continue this conversation. Actually, we're going to bring on another guest. I almost forgot what time it was. I thought we were still in the first hour. YouTube.